Well, welcome back, everybody, to Faith in Crisis, where we are discussing the perils of progressive Christianity. You know, there's a movement taking place. Christians across North America are deconstructing their faith. Disillusioned by a variety of different factors, Christians are calling long-held traditional beliefs into question. And if you were here last week, you would know that I introduced you to a woman named Elisa Childers, someone whose deconstruction actually resulted in a rare reconstruction into a stronger commitment to historic Christianity. But there are many more stories to tell, and unfortunately, most don't end so well. Today, it's internet sensations Rhett and Link, and if you're not familiar with them, what better way than just to show you a little video clip. Check it out.
Greasy. It tastes like an animal that stays close to the ground and lives amongst the humans. This thing's been in the trash. This is not grain-fed possum, man. This is like old pizza-fed possum.
All right, so that's Rhett and Link. They're eating possum pogos in that episode. Now, I've known about Rhett and Link for a long time. My son Joseph used to show me their videos many years ago, and he was so into them, we actually bought him, I think for Christmas or something, Rhett and Link's Book of Mythicality, a field guide to curiosity, creativity, and tomfoolery. And, you know, I have to say, these guys are really pretty entertaining. Rhett and Link are former Christian campus missionaries who turned their goofy talents with young people into an internet business that has done really well. They've grossed a net worth of somewhere around $23 million in internetainment to mostly young boys, often with them trying some kind of new food or some new way of eating food. That's basically their gig. Their Good Mythical Morning show has 17.2 million subscribers, and they've appeared on just about every late-night TV show that you can think of. Well, just last year, the duo officially abandoned their Christian faith, making their deconstruction public in February of 2020. Now, coincidentally, the pair arrived at their newfound agnosticism at the same time and went public with their announcements 1 week apart. And between those two episodes, they garnered almost 2.5 million views. It was really quite a thing. Well, what was most concerning to Christians who tuned into the show was the impact that it might have on their young and impressionable audience. And as Elisa Childers says, when she found out about this, she says the stories themselves weren't so different from others that have lit up social media over the past few years. For Rhett, it started with questions relating to science, the age of the earth, and evolution. It morphed into doubts surrounding biblical reliability, the historicity of the resurrection, and the general idea of hell and judgment. But as both Rhett and Link recounted, there was something brewing underneath the intellectual questions. They both felt a deep discomfort with biblical sexual ethics, which they perceived to oppress women and their LGBTQ plus friends. This is from February 29th from thegospelcoalition.com that Elisa wrote this. Well, since their deconstruction, many have speculated at the influences that may have caused them to go in this direction and to leave their faith. As one source pondered out loud, what would Rhett and Link stand to lose if they didn't capitulate to culture on an issue like same-sex marriage? How would it affect their revenue streams and net worth to remain faithful Christians in today's cultural climate? Well, those are pretty good questions. Sometimes, guys, deconstruction looks a lot like disintegration, more of an internal collapse under outside pressure, rather than a thought-out adjustment of specific theological concerns. And you're going to see this as we go through the series. You'll notice that for Rhett, his deconstruction began with questions relating to science, the age of the earth, and evolution. So guys, that's where I want to begin in week 2 of our series. I want to talk today about Genesis as history and about supernaturalism. Now, it's not the biggest argument in progressive Christianity, but it is a very significant one. And I believe it's often the issue that gets Christians started in questioning the authority of Scripture. And so, in that sense, it is very, very important. David Young, who we talked about last week, says, the creation account of Scripture could no longer be taken historically, and perhaps the entire Bible was more mythical than historical. Mythical, poetic, and even dismissive hermeneutics were developed by progressives for the purpose of updating biblical theology, to bring it into line with the work of Darwin and other scientific enterprises for progressive purposes. Many progressives exaggerated the differences between contemporary science and the biblical narrative. And so this is from his book, A Grand Illusion. So people like David Young, people like Elisa Childers, definitely see the discrediting of the creation account as a goal of progressive Christianity. And of course, they do this through evolution. Now, I want to say up front, what you believe about the origins of the universe and the development of life on earth is not an issue of salvation. True Christianity is about following Christ, and I want to make that very clear. But I also want to say this is a very serious topic because it leads to a discrediting of the Bible and even the views that Christ himself held, as we're going to see in today's message. I want to start by distinguishing between a couple of ideas related to evolution. So I want to start by talking about the issue of the age of the earth. Traditionally, you need to understand, traditional Christianity held to a young earth perspective. Now, it was based on genealogies going back to Adam and Eve that you could track through the Bible, and not actually the dating of rocks when this first started. That science wasn't available at that time. Personally, I'll just be upfront, I favor a perspective that sees mankind as coming into existence less than 10,000 years ago. And I can give you a couple reasons for that. First of all, the biblical genealogical record is quite convincing, and I really do trust the Bible when it comes to these facts that it shares. Secondly, if you're wanting to analyze it more from a scientific perspective, global population growth charts mesh very neatly with the biblical time frame of around, under 10,000 years for the development of human life on Earth. It isn't difficult to project human growth rates. You can do this. And in fact, if you go back and look from two people created just say around 6,000 years ago, and then the 8 people preserved on the ark about 4,500 years ago, the world's population very logically arrives somewhere around what we see today, 7 or 8 billion people. And so you can kind of chart this out and say, yeah, that falls within the range of what would make sense. But evolutionists are always telling us that humans have been around for hundreds of thousands of years. This has been a common theme among evolutionists. If we did assume that humans have been around for even 50,000 years, and if we were to use the very slow calculation of population doubling every 150 years, that's very conservative, there would have been 332 doublings over that period of time. And the world's population would be a staggering figure, the number 1, followed by 100 zeros. Yes, this is what the population of the earth would be in a very conservative estimate if humanity started even just 50,000 years ago. Guys, this is a huge problem for those who see the human race as having begun more than 10,000 years ago. Now, some will say, but maybe some of them died during the last ice age, which only ended, 11,500 years ago. Okay, but the question then becomes, where are the human remains? The earth should be a massive graveyard, chock full of human bones, but it is not. So I believe that there is way more evidence for a young humanity than an old one. But when it comes to the age of the earth itself, Christians cannot be quite so dogmatic. And you say, well, why? Well, because Genesis chapter 1, verses 1 and 2 says that God created the heavens and the earth first before starting his 6-day creation spree. Okay, so take a look at what it says here in Genesis chapter 1. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Now the earth was formless and empty. Darkness was over the surface of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the waters. And then it's when we see the creation account in its detail start. And it says, and God said, let there be light, and there was light. God saw that the light was good, and he separated the light from the darkness. God called the light day, and the darkness he called night. And there was evening, and there was morning, the first day. See, each creation day begins with that formula, and God said. So we don't know how much time went by before God started creating light on day 1. Is it possible that the creation of the earth and the creation of light were on the same day? Absolutely, it is possible. The text just doesn't require that. So I don't think anyone should be dogmatic when it comes to the age of the earth. So understand that I want to start by separating out this discussion on the age of the earth before moving on to the next point about evolution, and that is Darwinism. And this is where I really want to dig into things. This is the aspect of evolution that is extremely problematic and that contradicts the beliefs of historic Christianity. The biblical creation account has been accepted as fact for thousands of years. In fact, it's only in the past few hundred years that it's been seriously questioned, obviously, as non-biblical scientific explanations became more and more common. Today, our schools and museums present evolution as uncontested fact, and you know this to be true. In fact, if you're under 50 years old and you attended public school in Canada, that is all that you have ever been exposed to in school. But it's important for you to understand where it came from. And so let me give you a little bit of history here. If you go back into the 1700s, that's when the Enlightenment kind of kicked in, everything moving toward reason and rational thinking. That began to have some people start to question the biblical record. Then you move into the 1800s, and naturalism became a really big thing that flowed out of the Enlightenment, and that played in with some of the major sort of social movements that were happening at that time. Marxism that started then, socialism, communism that even flowed into the 1900s. And then in the 1900s, secular humanism really started to take off. Secular humanism took off as a religious movement in the early 1900s. And I want to emphasize that word religious movement because it really was. I would actually encourage you to look into the humanist manifestos. They have basically formed the playbook for educators in North America starting in the early 1900s. And if you're not familiar with them, you really need to check them out to see the agenda that was underway many, many years ago. We start with the Humanist Manifesto of 1933, the original one, which demonstrates clearly that humanism is a religion. It repeatedly uses the term religious humanism, if you go through that document, over and over again. Religious humanism says this, religious humanism says that. And the very first premise that it gives in this document is this, that religious humanists regard the universe as self-existing and not created. The very first thing that it brings up. They're wanting to establish that God is not part of the picture, that this is, if we're going to be humanists and depend on human reasoning alone and human ingenuity, we need to remove God. But they are saying back in that original document that they are religious humanists. When you get to 1973 and the second Humanist Manifesto, they shifted to drop the term religion or religious from the document. Now that was very strategic. They wanted to start separating themselves from religions in general and see that they're a better option and kind of smear religion with sort of a bad name. Now, it made lots of social declarations in that document regarding everything from abortion to divorce to sexual exploration to euthanasia, all kinds of social issues. And they started to get more militant in this second document. Some of the things they said, as non-theists, we begin with humans, not God, nature, not deity. They actually say in the document, no deity will save us, we must save ourselves. But then as it relates to science, look at what it says. They say science affirms that the human species is an emergence from natural evolutionary forces. So they're very clear, guys. They're using evolution as this vehicle to move people away from God and toward dependence on humans ourselves. We get to 1980, just 7 years later, and they came out with a secular humanist declaration. Well, this one got even more militant. It said things like, young minds should not be indoctrinated in a faith before they are mature enough to evaluate the merits for themselves. They said things like, traditional views of the existence of God either are meaningless, have not yet been demonstrated to be true, or are tyrannically exploitative. They say secular humanists find insufficient evidence for the claim that some divine purpose exists for the universe. They reject the idea that God has intervened miraculously in history. The document says men and women are free and are responsible for their own destinies, and that they cannot look towards some transcendent being for salvation. They also said, we do not accept as true the literal interpretation of the Old and New Testaments. So you can see they start getting a lot more militant, a lot more detailed, and really going after the Bible and Christianity. But then it goes heavy into evolution, even attacking creationists. Now take a look at what it says. They say, we deplore the efforts by fundamentalists, especially in the United States, to invade the science classrooms, requiring that creationist theory be taught to students and requiring that it be included in biology textbooks. It also said, it is a sham to mask an article of religious faith as a scientific truth and to inflict that doctrine on the scientific curriculum. If successful, creationists may seriously undermine the credibility of science itself. And so, guys, it's very important to understand that our culture's wholehearted embrace of evolution has not been driven by science. You need to see this very clearly. It has been driven by ideology, specifically the commitment to humanism. And this is going back over 100 years. Humanism made a clear and concerted effort to adopt evolution as its mechanism for removing God from people's minds and from their beliefs. And I need you to see that there has been a long-standing agenda to undermine biblical thought in favor of naturalism and in favor of humanism. You have to see this. That agenda has been played out to perfection, and Darwinism has been accepted now as fact. But, and here's what I want to check into this morning. Does Darwinism actually work? Well, you may not be aware of it, but there's actually a smoking gun that has emerged not too long ago. And I want to tell you about that today. You know, Christians have never stopped pushing back against evolutionary theory. We've continually lost ground over the last 100 years. I've read so much material over the past 40 years about the gaping holes that exist in neo-Darwinian theory. And so I've been aware of the problems with the theory. And I've known that it was only a matter of time before the problems began to get exposed, before the emperor saw that he had no clothes on, so to speak. But for years now, there's been an all-out assault on anyone in education who even dared present any kind of alternative view. If you want to watch an entertaining movie sometime, check out the movie called Expelled, No Intelligence Allowed. It's narrated by Ben Stein, who some of you may be aware of or familiar with. But he talks about how teachers all across North America were literally losing their jobs, university professors losing their jobs, if they even mentioned that they had any interest in intelligent design. It's really quite terrible when you take a look at it. Well, anyway, in 2009, a respected journalist named Susan Mazur released a book called The Alton Bird 16, an expose of the evolution industry. Now, let me explain what happened. There was a gathering of the top 16 biologists that was taking place in Austria. And Susan Mazur heard about it, and she said, oh, this is interesting. She had heard that they were getting together because they really could not make sense of evolutionary theory, that it was falling apart. And she thought, this is going to be an amazing story. She's not a Christian. She just was really interested and has a journalistic spirit of wanting to get to the truth. And so she wanted to go to this, but when they heard that she was interested and thought that she might expose too much, they actually shut her down and didn't allow her to come. Well, being the feisty journalist that she is, she said, I'm not going to let that stop me. So she said, I'll just go around and I will interview all of the other top biologists that weren't invited to this get-together. And so that's what she did. And she went around and interviewed all of these people, and the information that she came back with, the quotes that she came back with, really have formed what I would see as being the smoking gun when it comes to the fallibility of Darwinism and Darwin's theories. Let me actually share some of the quotes that she collected. Remember, these are from top biologists around the world. Here we go. Jerry Fodor says, basically, I don't think anybody knows how evolution works. Oh, sure, natural selection's been demonstrated. The interesting point, however, is that it has rarely, if ever, been demonstrated to have anything to do with evolution in the sense of long-term changes in populations. Summing up, we can see that the import of the Darwinian theory of evolution is just unexplainable caprice from top to bottom. That's from Stanley Salthe. Next one. There are people spouting off as if we know the answer. We don't know the answer, Stuart Kaufman said. Do I think natural selection should be relegated to a less important role in the discussion of evolution? Yes, I do, Scott Gilbert says. Susan Mazur was talking to Lynn Margulis. She said Lynn Margulis, sees natural selection as neither the source of heritable novelty nor the entire evolutionary process, and has pronounced neo-Darwinism dead, since there's no adequate evidence in the literature that random mutations result in new species. That's pretty clear. At that meeting, Francisco Ayala agreed with me when I stated that this doctrinaire neo-Darwinism is dead. He was a practitioner of neo-Darwinism, but advances in molecular genetics, evolution, ecology, biochemistry, and other news had led him to agree that neo-Darwinism's now dead. Next quote. The point is, however, that an organism can be modified and refined by natural selection, but that is not the way new species and new classes and new phyla originated. And so, what you can see, guys, natural selection is a real thing, and it can result in variation and adaptation within a species. Creationists have never argued with that. But it simply cannot account for transspeciation, this idea that one species can turn into another one. Unfortunately, many Christians have felt the need to accommodate Darwinism, being convinced by that the evidence for it is irrefutable. Most of them have never studied it properly. If they did, they would know that it is a desperately flawed theory. I actually got on the trail of questioning evolution when I was still in high school. And when I was in high school, I remember my grade 11 biology teacher teaching as a fact that this animal, the coelacanth, this fish, was a missing link between fish and animals with legs. It was also known as the mud puppy, and it lived around 400 million years ago, I was taught, and became extinct some 66 million years ago. So I'm listening to all of this. Well, a couple of years later, I was sitting in a doctor's office, and I came across an article, I think it was in Reader's Digest, that announced the finding of a live coelacanth off the coast of Madagascar. I'm like, really? Wow, check this out. You know what, guys? Live missing links, they're not all that impressive. And I found out that they've been finding them for years off the coast of Australia and Indonesia. Well, since that time, I've been tracking with evolution, and I have seen over and over again that it does not work, despite it now in our schools being taught as a fact. And they will even see the fact of evolution, they will say, or the law of evolution. And it's just not true. Progressive Christians today want to blend Christian faith with Darwinism, and this is what we call theistic evolution. It's basically evolution that just says, yeah, God started it. They've renamed that as evolutionary creationism more recently, but it's the same thing. It's just a blending in an attempt to try to hold both of these ideas together. Evolutionary creationists like to say that God created, but that he used the evolutionary model to do it, that he worked through evolution. But guys, that simply isn't even an option. Even the top evolutionary creationists are in agreement that evolution is a completely unguided process. Every evolutionist and every evolutionary creationist believes this. Even Richard Dawkins, who many progressive Christians feel the need to align with, says that theistic evolutions are deluded to try to marry creationism and evolution together. In fact, if you don't believe me, take a look. He said it himself.
And was there a particular point that, or something that you read, or an experience you had that sort of said, yeah, this is it, God doesn't exist?
Oh, well, by far the most important, I suppose, was understanding evolution. I think the evangelical Christians have really sort of got it right in a way in seeing evolution as the enemy, whereas the more, what should we say, sophisticated theologians who are quite happy to live with evolution, I think they're deluded. And I think the evangelicals have got it right in that there really is a deep incompatibility between evolution and Christianity, and I think I realized that at the age of about 60.
So you see, guys, progressive Christians are desperate to join with evolutionists, but they aren't welcome to the party. They're not welcome there. And it's sad because while some Christians are feeling the need to move toward Darwinism, scientists are ditching the theory in droves, and many Christians are not even aware of it. Guys, Susan Mazur has it right. It is an industry. It is an industry. It's a money-making thing, and it is crumbling from the inside. But don't expect to see, textbooks replaced in our schools, or don't expect to see information changed in our museums anytime soon. There has been a wholesale commitment to this theory, and humanists will never let God, or even the idea of intelligent design, back into the classrooms. But that doesn't mean that you can't know the truth and follow the truth. Now, here's some big reasons why Darwinism has just simply never worked at all. Let's take a look. First of all, the complete inability of natural selection to account for transspeciation. This is what we just finished talking about. Scientists have lost faith in the Darwinian model. And new DNA evidence is making it even clearer that this just does not work. As geophysicist Stephen Meyer says, the mechanism of natural selection and random mutation does not provide a remotely plausible account of how new biological forms and information might have arisen. He's very clear about that. Secondly, the complete absence of the fossil evidence that they say exists. Most people are stunned to find out just how non-existent the fossil record is. Transitionary life forms simply cannot be found. These things that they say that are transitions between one species and another, they just don't exist. Now, this isn't a new problem. Darwin himself said that it was, quote, the most and gravest objection which can be urged against his theory. He was very clear about that. And scientist Stephen Jay Gould, back in the 70s, said, the extreme rarity of transitional forms in the fossil record persists as the trade secret of paleontology. It's the trade secret. It's the inside information they don't want anybody to know about. What the fossil record does show us, guys, is a lot of mature, fully formed, non-transitional organisms buried all at once. It's what scientists typically refer to as the Cambrian Explosion, which is completely consistent with what the worldwide flood would have left. By the way, there are over 200 flood myths worldwide in virtually every culture on Earth. Where do you suppose those stories all came from? A third thing here, why Darwinism has never worked, well, it's the need for more time. For years, scientists have added more and more time to the evolutionary timeline in an attempt to make it sound just a little bit more reasonable, a little bit more believable. But you have to remember that the Darwinian model works on random mutations, and that mutations are 99% destructive to any species. Guys, mutations don't result in things getting better. They result in things like cancer that actually destroy the species faster. In other words, the more time you add, it doesn't help. It just becomes even less likely that it's able to happen. Stephen Meyer brilliantly explains how DNA must, at a certain point, fold into three-dimensional shapes in order to increase new functionality in an organism. It's really mind-blowing when you study this out. That two-dimensional DNA that then folds in on itself. But for every functional gene or protein fold, which has to happen randomly according to evolution, there are 10 to the 77th power possible non-functional sequences that could happen. Right? So the odds of it happening is incredible. Just to put that in context, there are only 10 to the 65th power atoms in our entire galaxy. Stephen Meyer says this: the mutation and selection mechanism does not have enough time in the entire multi-billion year history of life on Earth, he's using the evolutionists' most generous timelines, to generate but a small fraction of the total number of possible nucleotide base and amino acid sequences corresponding to a single functional gene or protein. A single functional gene. But we're pressured to believe that millions of these folds happened randomly and in some progression toward a new organism forming. Guys, even if these mutations happened in rapid fire, one after the other, there simply isn't enough time. This is the kind of evidence that we now have because of DNA, and it's causing scientists to abandon Darwinism. The fourth reason that I'll give you why Darwinism has never worked is philosophical and moral problems. You know, evolutionary theory is not only fraught with scientific roadblocks, it's also fraught with philosophical ones. For example, psychologists agree that true happiness in life is found through dedication to a worthy cause, not through self-gratification, as we often think that it is. But here's the thing. This runs contrary to Darwin's concept of survival of the fittest, which measures success by self-preservation. Survival of the fittest also contradicts virtually every moral law known to mankind, essentially encouraging people to lie or to cheat or to steal or even kill if necessary in order to look out for number one. And so this all doesn't work morally and philosophically. Well, we've only been dealing today with Darwin's theories and how one species, turns into another species according to his theory. But what about the even more difficult question that Darwin didn't even tackle, of where the first living organism came from? Think about it, guys. Without God or an intelligent designer, how did life come from non-life, intelligence from non-intelligence, personality from impersonality, purpose and order from chaos? You see, no one has ever observed any of these phenomena because they simply do not happen according to, wait for it, the rules of science. It does not happen. So if you want to get on the right side of science, I invite you to get back to the Bible and give the Bible another look. Now, I'm going to be honest, there is so much that we still don't understand, tons of stuff we don't understand, but I can tell you that the creation account is way more credible than current Darwinist models that are being pushed on your children and on our university students. Well, I want to talk a little bit here about theological problems with evolutionary creationism. We started on this, but I want you to understand there are some serious theological problems that come up when you latch onto this way of thinking. Regrettably, many progressive Christians embrace the beliefs of evolutionary creationists. In their model, evolution, death has been happening for hundreds of millions of years prior to man. This is what they will say, in contradiction to what the Bible says. A lot of them will say that there were like 10,000 ape-like hominids just wandering the earth and that God just went and picked two of them and made them Adam and Eve. And others will say, you know what, we can't even be sure that Adam and Eve even existed, that they're even literal characters. But what are the theological implications of those kinds of beliefs that Christians are now latching onto? Well, here's the first one. Death before the fall contradicts the clear narrative of Genesis chapter 3. According to Genesis 3, death was a result of the fall, and it hadn't been happening prior to the time of Adam and Eve. But according to this model, death had been happening for hundreds of millions of years, because that's what evolution requires. Secondly, death has to be seen as good in this scenario. That's a huge theological problem. If death was happening for millions of years and God called everything in the creation account good, you heard Elizabeth read that this morning numerous times, if everything was pronounced good prior to the fall, then death has to be good in this model. Guys, I'm going to tell you something. Death is not good. I attend and actually perform a lot of funeral services. I'm with a lot of people when they're dying. Death is not good. And in fact, in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, the Bible confirms this when it says that the last enemy to be destroyed is death. Don't lose sight of what the Bible actually says about death. Number 3, third theological problem is that Christ is no longer the second Adam, as Paul described him to be. If Adam didn't bring sin into the world, or if he didn't even exist, how can Paul then call Christ the second Adam in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, who takes us out of sin? And if we never really did fall into sin, do we really need to be pulled out of it? This starts impinging on all kinds of questions related to the atonement and all kinds of things. Number 4, another theological problem. If the fall is not the origin of sin and death, then Paul was just wrong. In Romans chapter 5, verse 12, look at what he says. Therefore, just as through one man sin entered into the world, and death through sin, and so death spread to all mankind because all sinned, right? You're seeing very clearly this is how sin entered the world, through one man, and death through sin. So guys, as you can see, huge doctrines that relate directly now to our salvation are being called into question. And there's just this domino effect where one just knocks over the next and the next. Writers like John Walton have reduced the creation story to myths no more credible than those in the ancient Near Eastern cultures. He gives the Bible no more credibility than those ancient Near Eastern cultures. It's really disappointing. So I want to talk to you quickly about just rejecting Genesis as history, as so many people are doing. Again, John Walton also leads many progressive Christians in rejecting a worldwide flood. He has books on all of these topics, and he's rejecting a worldwide flood as well. Again, that's very difficult because the Bible's pretty clear that it was a worldwide flood. He picks and chooses which parts of Genesis to take as actual history versus some type of allegory. And guys, once you decide that Genesis is questionable, then you end up questioning the entire Torah, the first 5 books, because most of us believe they were written by the same author. And that will lead you to questioning the literal plagues and the Red Sea crossing when we talk about the Exodus story. You just kind of keep going down the line. And then if you keep going, you'll be questioning Jonah, because that's kind of hard to believe. Elijah calling fire down out of heaven. right? And eventually what this leads to, guys, is the rejection of supernaturalism completely. Ultimately, it becomes apparent that for many progressives, they just don't like anything that is too supernatural because people don't look on it too well in this very naturalistic world that we're living in. It's a problem because Christian faith has always been supernatural in perspective. It's reasonable and it's rational, but it still allows for God and for His intervention. We live in a world where our box is open to the supernatural. Guys, if you keep questioning everything that's supernatural, eventually you will arrive at things like the virgin birth, like the miracles of Jesus, and even the resurrection. And I should point out that, the United Church of Canada, which many of us understand is very liberal, most, maybe not most, but a lot of the pastors in these churches wouldn't even believe in a literal resurrection, that church came from the Methodist Church that was started by John and Charles Wesley, that was highly evangelistic, extremely committed to the Bible. But over a period of 100, 150 years, it went in a completely different direction. It's really important to remember, guys, that as Christians, we are supernaturalists. We embrace that. And if that is challenging for you or if that's embarrassing to you, Christianity is probably just not for you. To me, the supernatural stuff is what makes Christian faith appealing. Think about it. The idea that God exists, that God became human through this thing called the virgin birth, that He demonstrated His deity by performing miracles, that He had power over nature, that He died and that He rose again from the dead, the greatest miracle of all, and that He is going to actually come back someday. Guys, I can't speak for you, but I love being a supernaturalist, living with the knowledge that God actually exists and that the world is not confined merely to the natural rhythms and patterns that we see around us. Guys, once you believe in God, you shouldn't have a problem believing that He could create the world in 6 days. And I've been watching for almost 40 years now for this death blow that everyone promised was coming to the Bible, right? Something's going to come along that's going to prove that this just doesn't work. Guess what, guys? The death blow has never come. And I just figure Jesus never questioned the historicity of the creation or of Adam and Eve, so why should I? Why do I need to do that? But when people are determined not to believe in God and in God's Word, they are forced to latch onto other beliefs about life and the origins of the universe, no matter how challenging those ideas might be. Guys, come on back next week. Next week, we're going to look at progressive Christianity's distaste for wrath and holiness. It just keeps getting better. See you then.